Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva, and as you can probably tell, I'm recovering from ETH Denver as of this recording. So I spent 4 days talking nonstop. My throat is not and voice are not the way they normally sound, but hopefully for the next one I'll sound normal again. Today, we're speaking with Elaine Kasket, Doctor of Psychology. Among other positions, Elaine is a professor of psychology at the University of Wolverhampton, an author and a keynote speaker. She is the author of All the Ghosts in the Machine, The Digital Afterlife of Your Personal Data, which proposes that what happens to our data when we die is the perfect lens for understanding the true power big tech wields over our information and our identities. And now, over to the conversation with Elaine Kasket. Elaine, thank you so much for joining us here on Orchid Private. We really appreciate you spending the time.
I'm really, really pleased and excited about whatever cool conversation we're going to have.
Well, everybody's already going to miss the Monty Python conversation we just had and the conversation about your cat and some of our children. But we're going to focus on some more salient topics to the podcast. And so let's get started with asking you what inspired you to study psychology and to focus specifically on technology and death.
Well, I mean, psychology, that's kind of going way back because I went to university in the United States and I went there for journalism. I went to IU, Indiana University, which has this great school of journalism, but I kind of got lured into psychology and did a double major halfway through and kind of continued with that. And I think I always thought that I would combine psychology and journalism to be like a popular science writer or something, but I didn't quite get around to that. The book that I wrote about technology and death and psychology is my first foray of that. Just took me a few decades to get there, that's all. But when I got into the technology and specifically death and technology side of things, it was just when I'd signed up to Facebook, was probably about 6 months, a year after Facebook was unleashed on the general public. And I stumbled across what was very common then, less common now, which is a rest in peace type memorial group, which is how people used to kind of do memorialization on early days social media, which is to kind of create a group for people to join that was separate to the person's in-life profile. Now you kind of almost don't need memory groups, although they still do get created, because the kind of in-life profile kind of morphs into the memorial, right? I came across this phenomenon and immediately got very interested in how people were interacting with that group versus the young woman's in-life thing, which I was able to also see. Privacy settings weren't really as common then as they are now. So I was able to just click through and see who this person was. And I was fascinated by the differences. I was fascinated what was going on there and the conversations that people were continuing to have with each other and with the person who died. And I started studying it more formally. And that was a really long time ago now, but it just keeps evolving. And it only becomes more relevant all the time, which makes it so much more exciting. There's so much in the news, actually, that is relevant to this. It's crazy. Like even, for example, when the chef Anthony Bourdain died and the Roadrunner documentary was made about him, they deep faked audio of stuff that he never said to put into the film. And at least initially, weren't identifying what those things were, or reconstituting James Dean to star in a new feature film and Finding Jack, or, hologram tours of pop stars that continue, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I remember the Michael Jackson hologram for a concert.
The Billboard Music Awards
6 or 7 years ago. Yeah, and I mean, it didn't look anything, like an actual real thing to me. But I was like, that. I mean, that's kind of cool. And then Tupac as well. They did something for Tupac Shakur, a similar thing at another. I think that was Coachella. Bringing him back to life, quote unquote, for a concert. I'm just thinking now. I don't think anybody's really tried it since those two, at least not.
Oh no!
Not in a really big way.
You're out of that particular loop. It happens all the time.
For a concert, at least for a concert.
Well, I mean, Whitney Houston was on tour just before the pandemic started, or the lockdown started in the UK, and I think it was March 2020. She was here. Maria Callas, of course, Roy Orbison. They were going to bring back, oh gosh, what's her name? Like a jazz singer, a jazz blues singer from the 1950s or something, going really way back. They were going to do that. It's the Pepper's Ghost illusion. It's a really old illusion, but obviously it's all amped up through base holograms, wizardry and all that kind of stuff. So I think they're probably getting a bit better at it than they were when Tupac and Michael Jackson did it. But these holograms, they fill stadiums. And, there's stories in the news like, I feel like this is a very pandemic story. The student at Concordia University who was taking an art in Canada, who was taking an art history class, really enjoying it, emailed his professor because he had a question, didn't get an email back, started wondering where the professor was, Googled him and found an obituary. They were just rolling out the professor's lectures from the year before he died for this course at the remote learning, So you're starting to see, I'm so glad I got into this area way back in the day, because it's only becoming more important. It's only becoming more relevant. And I'm hoping we're going to talk loads about this, because the data of the dead stay intertwined with the data of the living, and they can kind of be used as a conduit to kind of mining insights about the living. They're really consequential for the privacy of the living. And this is, I think, is one of the reasons that companies hold on to it and guard it and hoard it, when actually it would be a lot more cost effective to jettison it. And so it is hugely fascinating territory. And I have to almost say a disclaimer at this point, because a lot of people listening to this, because life has a lot of loss in it, maybe particularly these days, people listening to this have lost somebody, maybe lost somebody recently. And I think I get really intellectually interested in this topic. So I think it's fun and fascinating and all those kinds of things. And so I just want to acknowledge that sometimes if I get a bit carried away by some of this stuff and have a good time talking about it, I hope that doesn't, feel hurtful to somebody or disrespectful to somebody who's grappling with the pain of having lost somebody and perhaps maybe having to deal with their digital footprint after they're gone as well.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I'll add on something there too. I mean, I don't try to be callous about it. I just, I'm one of those people who's like, people die. People die all the time, whether it's somebody who's close to me or somebody who's close to you or somebody who's close to another person. So, I don't know. I could have been a cop in the sense that I have a very black humor at times. I've dealt with loss as well. All my grandparents are gone. I know, I'm well aware that that at some point my parents are going to go as well, and that I will go as well. So I've just come to grips with that. But other people have very different ways of coping, or have not been able to come to grips with a recent loss or an upcoming loss or what have you. So I do speak about death in a very blunt way, and you probably have to as well, considering all the topics you're dealing with and writing about. So I guess, before we go any further, this is going to be Elaine and Derek being very open and blunt about death and the things we need to consider, as opposed to, beating around the bush about the topic. And I think, at least I've certainly got a personal story of realizing like, oh shoot, something might happen at any point here, and I better do something about it real quick before it does, so that it's not too late. So I guess,
100%. A lot of what I hope is that companies come to the same kind of bluntness or the same kind of facing up to it, because if basically every company that dealt with our data around the world was as realistic and anticipatory of the fact that 100% of their account holders or users or whatever were eventually going to die, then we'd be in a better situation. So this conversation is an encouragement to those companies, those organizations, to regulators to say, hey, we need to get real about the fact that 100% of people die. Increasingly, given the global penetration of smartphones around the world and everything like that, a lot of us are leaving behind these really rich digital footprints that are connected to the data that are living, and we need to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a great segue to tell us about your book. It's called All the Ghosts in the Machine, the digital afterlife of your personal data. Can you tell us a little bit about it and some of the topics you cover?
Sure. I mean, I started writing that book in 2018, I guess, and it was the culmination of, at that point, having been looking at this area for over a decade. It kind of summed up where my thinking was at that point. And originally, I started looking at this phenomenon through more of a psychologist lens. So I was interested in the experience of mourning and grieving online or in a technologically mediated way. But I think in doing All the Ghosts in the Machine, in what I hope is a helpful way, I really got out of my lane a lot because I realized that it was kind of impossible to understand the psychological and emotional dimensions of death in the digital age without also understanding what was going on legally or what was going on with the deal with contract law or, you know, the thinking about the power relationships between big technology companies and us and all sorts of other things that aren't strictly psychological, if you see what I mean,
Sure.
but which definitely have a psychological impact. And so I look at death in the digital from a whole lot of different angles. And that includes ethical, and that includes legal, and that includes psychological and social and all that kind of stuff. So it's a fundamentally multidisciplinary kind of subject. You can't really just look at it from one vantage point. It kind of, because everything is, it's just so interconnected, it touches on every area of our lives. So I cover a lot of different stuff, mourning and bereavement and stuff at the beginning, of course. But then the whole kind of terms and conditions and what all we're really signing away and how that enables these data controllers to have a whole lot more power over us and our identities after we die than they even did when we were alive, because we don't have a legal personality anymore after we're dead to sort of do anything about it.
Right.
I look at the problem of that data being connected to the data of the living, so the privacy considerations. I tangle with the question of like, wow, now that we have such well-developed digital reflections and there's so much personal and sensitive information that we store about ourselves, should the dead still have ongoing legal personalities in some sort of way as protection, not just for their identity so that they can't be impersonated, for example, or that their data can't be used to exploit people or engage in criminal behavior, what needs to happen so that we better protect the living. So I got into a whole lot of questions like that in the book. So well beyond the more psychological side of things.
Yeah, that sounds riveting. I'm actually gonna. I haven't read it, I'll have to confess, but it's something I've given.
That's okay.
Not nearly as much thought as you have, I'm sure, but a lot of thought about because my parents do have a lot of, or at least a few social profiles that I'm gonna have to deal with. I'm an only child, so I'm gonna have to deal with those myself, and others who have come to me like, what do you think I should do with my grandma's Facebook page or my aunt's Facebook page? And I'm like, or profile. Like, I mean, you're gonna, you do have options now on to memorialize that, or you could just pretend it never happened and just delete it if it's too hard for you to look at. Like, that's really up to you. It's a very personal decision. But to that extent, like, how?
Yeah, it might be a really personal decision.
Yes.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to kind of jump in there to say it might be a really personal decision, a really personal preference, but here's the social media profile of somebody who died, right? And then you have loads of people connected to that, all of whom have a stake in it in some sort of way, but who might have really different opinions and needs about that. So, grandma's, sister, another fellow Silver Surfer or whatever, might be really keen to keep the profile up, and somebody else, like their son or daughter, might really not want it. So this is where you get into this area where there are no easy answers, because none of those people's preferences are right or wrong, but you've got this one centrally held thing. And it's a pretty blunt instrument. It either gets deleted or it stays, or it's either in remembering mode, memorialization sort of format, or it's not. Or you either, unfriend the dead, basically, which is a really psychologically complex kind of thing to do, or you deal with it. So users don't have a whole lot of fine-grained control over how they want to interact with a profile or how they want it to show up for them. So that's the tough thing. It is a personal decision, but you might not be able to be in a position to make the decision you want.
Yeah, I know. There was a woman who, very well known and very well respected, in the town I grew up, who passed away. Oh, I don't know, maybe about a decade ago now. And for a little while, we were friends on Facebook, and I'd run into her when I was in town and that sort of thing, and we'd talk, and so I left her there for a little while. But right around the her birthday, like her actual birthday or the anniversary of her death, all sorts of comments would start, and I'm like, I don't need to be reminded personally that this person has passed away. Like, it was sad at the time. It's not, it's still sad now. And like, I also don't want to tread on anybody else's ability to memorialize or make a comment and be like, I'm thinking about you or whatever. So I did unfriend that account because I know there's nobody running it now, and like there's no new content. That would be weird. And and I'm just twice, 2 or 3 times a year, I'm reminded of the fact that she's gone. So I'm like, I'm just gonna unfriend this person now, because I don't need to see it all the time. My grandparents thankfully did not have social media accounts. They just weren't savvy enough or didn't care to do that. But that was somebody's grandma and mother and aunt and all that, and I'm like, I just don't need to see it anymore. So I'm beyond social media
What
profiles and stuff like that. Like, how would you define the term digital afterlife?
Well, this is where I think it's really important to underline the fact that a lot of people's minds gravitate towards social media when they think about things like digital footprint, and they assume that if they don't have social media, don't deal with it very much, then they don't have a digital legacy or a digital footprint that's worth thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I think social media is really just the tip of the iceberg, because when we have assets that are held in digital form, like crypto, for example, or other things of value that we might store, for example, intellectual property that we might have on Google Drive, or if you're a
Mm-hmm.
photographer, say, and you might hold that digitally, and kind of various things like that. There's all of the interactions that we've had with anybody on any platform, messaging, email, whatever else. We have, there's air miles, there's location data, there's medical data, there's health data, so there's so much stuff that could potentially be consequential. Might be consequential in a grieving sense, because I think that people in the digital age who have lost somebody and they've got the laptop, they've got the phone or whatever, might run into two broad categories of difficulty. One, they've got access to more than they
Right.
want, more than they expected, more than they signed up for. If they can get into the devices, which is increasingly uncommon because of all of the privacy protections and password protections we have to put on during life and that we need to put on during life, it makes it that much harder for anybody who might want or need to get into the stuff after we've died. So you might get access to, but if you can get in, you might have access to too much. Like, wow, okay, I'm finding out stuff that I didn't want to find out. There's stuff in here that's confusing me or worrying me, but the person's no longer alive for me to even check it
Right.
out with them, or maybe repair something that needs repairing. Or you might have access to absolutely nothing at all, both in the practical sense or in the sentimental sense. There was a really well-known court case that happened here in the UK, which is one of the things that that was driving Apple's recent decision to roll out a legacy contact feature at a device level for their iPhone, where a widow whose husband was the family photographer and stored all of the pictures of their family, including their daughter, on his iCloud. He died unexpectedly, and they couldn't get to
Mm.
any of that stuff. And that court battle was 3 years.
Wow.
3 years. But it didn't rise to the level of a landmark case here in the UK. So that meant that any family it happened to again would just have to go through the same thing, right? And so this is one of the reasons why Apple's gone ahead and done this legacy contact thing on the phones, so that you would. But so yeah, but in order to avail yourself of that, you have to know about it. You have to set it up.
Yeah.
It's simple to set up, but there might be some barriers. Your legacy contact also has to have an Apple ID. There's other kinds of things that might stop people from doing it. And so, yeah, it's our whole lives pretty much. Like, at least for those of us on this side of the digital divide, right? Who have got our smartwatches on and our smartphones and are doing everything on the computer, which has only, increased since the pandemic. Your digital footprint is pretty much your mirror. It's like your mirror image, in a way, it's almost more because it's tracking everything. It's remembering everything. It's recording everything. Our physical brains might forget stuff or jettison stuff, and we get to evolve and change and say, oh, really, that's not me anymore. But then somebody grieving us might find that email thread from 2018 and say, oh my God, I never knew this person. Look what they were really like or whatever. So it kind of like fixes us, and it's it's a long answer, but the thing is, it's a big mountain of stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's super consequential.
I'm just thinking, so like, have you seen like digital afterlife curator services pop up? I mean, this almost seems like a necessity at some point. And I've thought about starting a startup to actually like take like obviously, super secure, quantum encrypted, whatever, take passwords from people so that when they do pass away, there's some sort of, I don't know, signal, or like we'll be one of those organizations where you could provide the death certificate to, we'll validate that it's that this person has actually passed away, and we'll pass all this stuff to you, as opposed to my current very haphazard plan of like making an Apple Note on the plane. I'm on my way to Paris or Denver
In
and
case you go down.
sharing my Bitwarden password with my spouse, just in case something happens and I go down in the middle of the Atlantic, so that she has access to the bank accounts and my hardware wallet and the software, my cold wallet, my hot wallet, and all this other stuff that she doesn't touch right now because she doesn't want to, or she doesn't understand it. And just to make sure that there's no hindrances there. Like, here's the checking account, and you know where to find the life insurance policy anyway. Like, that's not hidden by any means, but like, I've got my passwords. I don't want those to be known by just anybody, so I share it once or twice a year when I go away. Like, here's the thing, just in case I go down, and you don't have to spend 3 years in court, getting access to what is ultimately at this point your money because it was in my estate.
Yeah, and I've seen that mooted as one of the careers of the future. And in fact, in the United States, or in most states in the United States anyway, they've got some version of this model law about, it's got a really long name, it's really boring. It's like Revised Uniform Fiduciary Assets Act or something like it's called RUFADA. But it basically like sets up a situation where you can have a kind of digital executor, appoint a digital executor that has limited powers to be able to help people out with that. So anybody doing estate planning really needs to find somebody who knows what they're talking about with respect to that. But of course, that's not in all jurisdictions, and we don't have the equivalent of that in the UK at the moment where I live. But I think there's two things here. One is the kind of what's pragmatic, and then there's what's legal, and these things might not be the same thing. So you gave an example of like, oh, she'd get it anyway, she's in my estate or whatever it is, but people have all sorts of situations. And I think that we've really got to find a way to get around the giving people access or giving people passwords kinds of options, because I think that's really fraught with a lot of difficulties. Because if you can imagine, if the right people get hold of it, like the executor to the estate or whatever it is, which might be your wife in any case, okay, fine. But if something goes wrong with that and passwords that you're passing around get into the wrong hands, it's possible for a whole lot of things to happen before you get to probate or you get to all the procedures that you need to do. So it's tough because most accounts are one account, one user, right?
Right.
Like in some cases, allowing other people or granting other people access to a particular kind of account might not even be legal. Might be,
Right. Right.
and so, but because people don't know what to do to handle these kinds of issues, people end up doing all these hacks and workarounds and these kind of vaguely, not kind of kosher things to make everything okay, but it's just really jerry-rigged. Is this really awkward, janky kind of system that isn't working very well. But that's because we live in such different territory and it's moved on so fast, but the law is really slow. So this is one of those areas where the law is lagging way, way behind technology. And the laws that we have around how do you pass on stuff to people, or what happens to people, when people die, or what's executable in a will. It's just nowhere near caught up to the tech.
Yeah. And I mean, not to mention in terms of defining the digital afterlife, like there's all that data that you own, that you have access to, but especially for people like you and I, there's all this stuff that other people potentially have recorded and put on YouTube or on Twitter or on Facebook of like photos and videos. And like at this point, I don't know if I can expect anything other than somebody's going to try to, take all the YouTube videos or audio of me, make a synthetic voice, synthetic Derek, and try to fool some people just before I die that, something has happened, and
call up your bank. Yeah. Or like sort of
call
change your will.
Like, yeah.
It's just,
call up my kids, like, hey guys, I got myself arrested and I need you to wire I need you to send me 5 ether so I can for bail money.
And yeah, see, I actually, Derek, worry about talking about this on podcasts or talks, because I worry I'm going to give somebody ideas, because I feel like at the moment, right, on the dark web, dates of death and names have a going rate in Bitcoin. Well, why are those valuable, right? Yeah. And you think about the really meteoric, rise and sort of, improvements in the kinds of technologies that enable us to do audio and video, even video, deep fake, to the extent that in that Roadrunner movie, Anthony's voice, you wouldn't have never known that he didn't say that in life. That would fool you. That could fool his bank, whatever. So I really worry that there's this window between when people die and when the estate is able to figure out what to do, even figuring out where the assets are held. I mean, if you said to me, hey, where do your parents do their banking, right? I have no idea where my parents do their banking. And my parents have got a passcode on their phone. Yeah. I don't know what it is. They do all of their banking by app, as far as I know, and they've got passwords on their computer. Yeah. So how am I even supposed to figure out where they bank? They don't get any, sort of statements in the mail anymore. Yeah. So a lot of times you might have a really hard time even figuring out where the relevant assets are that are held. And so people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off in the period of time during the death, after death, trying to figure stuff out. And there's a window there that can be exploited, where somebody can use, all the information they can lay their hands on to impersonate someone or to otherwise kind of hack into things. And that's really, really concerning to me. I think there's going to probably be a little crime wave of that kind of variety before we are able to get a handle on things. And that's one of the reasons I think this is so urgent. It's the last thing that people need to be dealing with, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ethical and the technical issues. I think we've kind of already addressed a lot of that in talking here about, like, I mean, I guess conversely, my parents are immigrants, so I know where everything is, because it's just a, very different culture where, like, they were really open with me about, how much money they had, where the money was, which companies hold the investments, etc. I'm fairly open with them too, because I don't really care if they know or not. And I know they're really proud of how successful, I've been, because that was the whole reason they moved to Canada in the first place. So I feel like I almost owe it to them to be like, look at all this cool stuff I can afford to buy because you guys, moved to Canada and raised me right. And and gave me all these opportunities to go to school and stuff like that. And then got out of my way when I didn't want to do any of the things that you thought I should do as an adult. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a podcaster and community manager instead in crypto. But that's worked out pretty well the last 4 years. So yeah, but
But yeah, it's
I'm
great that you're open with each other in that way.
yeah,
But a lot of people aren't. Like, a lot of people don't. I interviewed somebody for the book, because a lot of what the book is, I interviewed somewhere between 75 100 people. So there's a lot of people's voices in the book
yeah,
from all sorts of different vantage points. And a couple of people who were bereaved, I interviewed them, and one of them talked about her father having fallen down the stairs at home, and the only reason they were able to get stuff sorted out, including stuff to do with his business — he was an online bookseller — was because he was a bit of a dinosaur and didn't have a passcode on his phone. So they were basically hacking, impersonating. They got into other accounts by saying forgot password, and then
Yeah.
they had access to the Gmail or whatever. So they were able to kind of reset passwords to get things in.
yeah.
So they had to hack all these kinds of things. But I wouldn't be able to do that with my folks because they've got all the passwords on, and I'm glad they do. I'm glad
Yeah.
they've got all those passwords
It's secure.
on.
That's great.
But I know they haven't updated to iOS 15.3 or whatever it is that you need in order to be able to set a legacy contact. I can guarantee you they haven't done that.
Yeah.
So that's going to be one of my missions when I go home, and visit them next, is to get them all set up on that, because they've got like a binder of stuff, but that won't necessarily help me figure out some of the stuff to do with their digital footprint or their social media, because I bet you anything they've changed passwords along the way and they haven't recorded it in the binder, right? Because we're encouraged to change passwords all the time. But you said something a minute ago, Derek. You said, oh, well, there's the stuff that we own, or the data that we own, but then there's the stuff that other people put up. And that's a really good point, because a lot of our digital footprint isn't created by us. It's actually created by other people who reference us in various ways, or so it's an actual co-constructed thing. But the word own, of course, is really contested, because we have this conceit or idea that there's certain digital stuff that we own. And sometimes we're mistaken about that. I mean, you might own your crypto, but do you own the data that you put on a social media platform? Or do you own the movies that you buy on iTunes or Google Play or something like that?
No.
Crypto, I think yes. Correct me if I'm wrong. But iTunes, no. And Kindle books, no. And the stuff and the data that you put on a platform under their terms and conditions, often no. And so we don't have that data ownership, data portability that people like Tim Berners-Lee and with Solid and everything are now so hot on trying to kind of push to kind of give us back something more like data ownership, true data ownership, which means data portability, which means decentralization and all sorts of stuff to do with blockchain, developments and all that stuff. But own is probably not the word that we use now for a lot of the stuff that we've got.
You're absolutely right. I guess I really meant more like, I'm the one who put it up, right? I log into Facebook with my account. I generated it. I uploaded it. And therefore, if you have access to that account, you can take it down, right? And honestly, like, even that's a conversation.
Yes, exactly. If you set it up.
Yeah. And that's really just something I need to decide of, like, what do I want to happen with my Facebook account and my Twitter account? I think I'd rather just see it all taken down, because otherwise it's going to be there almost solely for Twitter, Facebook's, etc.'s benefit, and certain, LinkedIn and so on, these Web 2.0 platforms, not for my benefit, and probably not, or certainly not benefit for the estate as a purely legal entity. And my kids might decide, like, no, I want to look at dad's Facebook account for another 6 months or so. Fine. But at some point, maybe a year later, like, I want that taken down, and or at least at this point, I would want it taken down, because there's no point for it to exist anymore. It's literally just for Facebook at that point, if Facebook even exists 50, 60 years from now.
Yeah, but you mentioned your kids and what they might want, and not necessarily knowing what that is. But if you were to go into the legacy contact settings on Facebook, and if you were to tick the box that says, I would like my profile to be deleted upon death, that would mean that as soon as Facebook found out about your death by whatever means, and sometimes there's been a lot of reports of Facebook, realizing somebody's dead without the family informing. Sometimes with a high profile thing or something in the news, it gets memorialized. But if you ticked take it down, then it would be taken down, and your kids might not be able to have, kind of like a say over it. And, it might only be for Facebook, but one of the things, when was the last time, for a long time, I used Facebook as my primary way of sort of storing memories and photographs and things like that. And so it was a real repository or an archive and I don't do any sharenting anymore. I haven't done, after doing the research for this book, I completely stopped all of that and haven't posted an image of my kid in the last sort of 3.5, 4 years or whatever it is. But before that, because I live far from my country of origin, I really used that as a way of keeping my family in particular easily up to date with how she's growing and developing and everything like that. So it was this real archive. And before I stopped doing that and before I used Jumbo or whatever to kind of batch delete all the past posts, I made sure to print all of that out because it was the only place that I had really, it was like a baby book or something. Like it was the only place where I'd done that. And I would hate for my daughter to not eventually have access to those kinds of things. This is so interesting because it's like we've got this thing of online is forever, and we have this kind of idea. We talk so much about careful kids, what you put online lasts forever, or people will always be able to see it, this kind of, but actually data loss, or more specifically loss of data access, happens all the time by various means. And I don't know by what mechanism my grandchild, for example, who I don't have a grandchild, my eventual grandchild, by what mechanism would they be able to see something I posted on Instagram or I posted on Facebook? Like there's no way of, do you know what I mean?
Well, especially if it's
whereas they are probably much more likely.
No, go ahead. If they're much more like
to see something I printed out in a traditional photo album or something. Do you know what I mean? You know,
well, especially if you have a private Instagram account,
kind of paradoxical.
That means they need to ask to follow it, and somebody who controls access then needs to let them follow the Instagram account. So that doesn't help anybody. Ditto. Especially about my kids, we've always been really careful about how much we post on Facebook or anywhere else, but primarily Facebook, about our children, mostly because I think they should be fully in charge of their digital footprint as much as possible. And so, like, you want me to send a picture to you, I will send it privately, whether it's Facebook Messenger, which obviously is still a Facebook platform, or creating a Google Photos album and letting you, giving you a link to that or something like that. Something slightly more controlled, as opposed to just, here's this public Facebook photo album or one that's available to all my friends, and we're just going to put it up there and then leave it there forever. Because I know that at some point, my oldest is going to get his own Facebook account, probably sometime this year because he'll be 13. And then, and I can almost certainly bet that regardless of what Facebook says about deleting all their facial recognition stuff, there's going to be some sort of, they're going to figure out that, like, all these other pictures, hey, we know that kid.
Absolutely. Oh, 100%. And I'm so glad you brought that up because, it's, as you know, in most jurisdictions, it's not legal to identify, data with a sort of a child under such and such an age, up until whatever it is in that country, 13, 16, whatever. But what it is child A and child B and child C of this named individual. And then the person, and then the kid comes of age and it all kind of marries back up together. I mean, like, there's no way big data is going to be sitting there scratching its head, sort of saying, oh, is there any connection between these people? So, and what you're talking about, that considered decision to not share, this is not the place most people are in because a lot of people just aren't aware of these things. I was talking to a colleague of mine in Australia, Tamalever, and he's the reason that I know the word baby valence. He looks a lot at not just sharing of children's data, but he's got 4 kids, and he got interested in the sharing of sonograms and the practice of sharing sonograms, because when his first kid was born, the people that did the scan said, he said, we were probably the last people in the world to be offered a VHS tape of our, sort of sonogram. And then by the time the kid came along, they had the final sonogram, they'd already upgraded it. It was a burn CD. And then a second kid was like a USB stick, second and third kid. And then the 4th kid basically was offered by the service that was doing the sonogram a fully realized bespoke social media service that they emailed you the link with the button that you kind of click to say share the sonogram with share it with your friends.
No.
And I know, mind blowing, right? And so what that does from such an early, and there's a huge percentage of people who do share sonogram on social media, often with identifying information on that sonogram still on there, the name of the mom, all this kind of stuff. And so people just share it, maybe with aid of these services that are being so helpful. Click here to share to Instagram. And that early on normalizes the practice of sharing, and it kind of creates this expectation that sharing is what you do, and it's very easy to roll that into. So you've done all the sharing, and you've done the app where you say, my baby's the size of an aubergine this week, my baby's the size of a watermelon this week, whatever it is. And then really when you're a new parent and you're smitten and the beautiful baby does arrive, the kind of urge to kind of like share is so, like, are you really going to say, okay, now I'm going to stop sharing? So it's created really early on. And the physiological monitoring of infants with technologies like the Owlet sock, which is a kind of a pulse oximetry sock that's marketed for huge amounts of money, that the device itself, but where they get a lot of their profits as well is by using that data to sell to third parties. And is it de-identified data? Yes. Could it be re-identified? Potentially. Could it be used so that, I don't know, they find out years down the line, big data gives us the fantastic correlation that infants with this pulse oximetry reading when they're 6 months old are likely to have a coronary event around the age of 48. Well, that's going to sound like a really excellent time to cancel the private health insurance, right? Do you know what I mean? So there's consequences from data that can be logged way back that you didn't choose,
right?
That you didn't opt to put out in the world, that is then going to be used in potentially really influential ways in your life, and you didn't have anything to say about it. You've got no agency.
Yeah, even like
that's part of our digital footprints too.
Yeah, and to that extent, with the with your example, the Owlet. And sorry, do you have a couple more minutes here?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I've got like one more question I want to ask before we wrap up here. We've got a smart thermometer from Withings, and you have the option to like set up profiles in the app, and so like. There's mine, there's my spouse's, and the 3 kids. We all have our own temperature readings. Well, realistically, I don't have any time to like go back into the app after the temperature readings, and we all have COVID, early last month, to like make sure that like, oh yeah, this person's temperature, that was that person's temperature, that was that person's temperature. So like, we're still using it, but I'm sure we're not using it in the way Withings would like us to. We're going back into the app, be like, yep, yours, like categorizing and like, so I'm like, it's not de-identified, it's not anonymized because it's obviously belongs to our family. It's all, it's all showing up on my Withings account, but like, I'm not going back in and like tying temperatures back to different people, because ultimately I'm really worried in the moment. Do you have a fever? Yes or no? And if so, let's give you some Tylenol or Advil or ibuprofen or acetaminophen and get you not feverish anymore. And so like, that's my concern. And so like, I'm using the data, I'm generating a footprint there, but it's, at least at this point, it looks like it's like 99% mine. Just incessantly taking my own temperature. And it's like, within a few degrees of variation. So, as opposed to like the Owlet being specifically like for that child.
Like you're saying, that in the moment, that's what's important to you, and our digital footprint is made up of all those gazillion things that were important to us in the moment, in that context, but then which get logged, and then which might get narrated or storied or perceived in different ways when we're no longer around creating our own stories, when people are accessing our data to kind of make stories or kind of about us. And so that's kind of where I kind of didn't expect to get to when I was writing the book about death in the digital. I had no idea that in the latter chapter, in the penultimate chapter, I'd be talking about the sharenting stuff and the baby valence stuff and my reflections on whether I should have been sharing those things, because I was taking this really powerful role in creating my daughter's own eventual legacy and creating expectations that people, including strangers that she'd never met before, already had ideas about her when they met her. She never met a stranger literally, because they had all these impressions about her from social media. And so I'd kind of cast this really long shadow, and I thought, wow, I've kind of set this thing in motion and exercised a huge amount of power. And I've kind of, and I want her to determine her own legacy. I don't want to be determining that for her, digital or otherwise. She needs to be her own person. But I think, so that was an unexpected connecting thread that I kind of got to when I set out to write a book about death in the digital. I ended up in quite a different place, which is why I'm writing a book now about privacy and technology and relationships across the whole of the lifespan, from pre-cradle to post-grave and everywhere in between. Which is ending up being a lot about these kind of intimate surveillance kind of things that we do, where we monitor and surveil kind of one another and kind of play fast and loose with other people's data.
First of all, you use the word penultimate, which is a very British word.
Is it?
Not one. Every time I hear penultimate, I think of going back to Monty Python, the skit where Michelangelo is showing I think it's Michelangelo showing the picture of the painting of the Last Supper, and there's like kangaroos and stuff, and Pope's going like, that's not the Last Supper. Well, it's the penultimate supper.
The second to last supper.
Put the word penultimate, that's what I think of. The second to last supper. He had kangaroos and dancers there, and not follow. That's a horrible segue. But following on from that, two final questions. What do you consider some of the most important implications of how big tech, big data treats all this data that it's collecting about us?
Well, I'd like to highlight a kind of weird stealth, very not often thought of aspect, which is the environmental aspect. Because think about how much data of the dead, because it's being held onto, and I think it's because they're thinking, oh, some of this data may have future uses. It just kind of gets all stuffed down the craw of, big data, and they hang on to and monetize the data of the deceased in various ways. But I'm thinking, all of these millions of people dying, all of this data that they've generated during life, still hanging around and being saved and having to be cooled down in these data centers. That's just crazy to me, as is the idea, which is put about quite a lot in certain quarters, that would be a really good idea to create artificially intelligent avatars of people who die, and, dad bots and, kind of wife bots and things like that, to help us in our grief or for reasons that nobody knows what for. I'm just thinking, so the carbon footprint of an AI like that is huge. Like, who among us justifies that, and what for? Why are we trying to solve for grief now using technology when people have lived and died and people have grieved for millennia? And so suddenly now here we have all this data to kind of create an interactive avatar now, then somehow this is a good idea, or something that Microsoft gets a patent for, or, that to me, I feel like perspective, this is what I really want to emphasize. I want to emphasize having these kinds of perspectives, and that perspective is largely driven by the question of what for? Like, what are we hanging on to this for? Now, I don't know that a lot of these companies necessarily have an immediate answer to the what for, although there are probably ways that they're monetizing the data, even if it's only about the retention of living users, but it also might be mining insights about living users from the data of the deceased, because of course, the deceased are definitively out of contract, and they can be used as a sort of conduit. There might be other ways in which they're utilizing it, but they also might just be thinking, this data might be useful someday, in this post theory, post whatever big data landscape. And so I feel like we really need to get a lot of perspectives on what for, and just because technology makes something possible doesn't mean it's suddenly a good idea and suddenly means that grief is a problem to be solved in a way that it wasn't before. So
yeah. Have you seen Black Mirror, that series?
Yeah. So the Be Right Back episode, season 2, episode 1, it was directed by Charlie Brooker. And that's
the one where the husband passes away, and she orders she orders a automaton version of him, right?
Yeah. That's right.
Yes.
First, she gets kind of the bronze level service, which is the more interactive chat. Well, it like goes from email messages to the audio
Right.
chat bot type thing. And
Yeah,
then
yeah,
she
yeah.
thinks, oh, she gets suckered
Upgrades.
into the platinum service. And no spoilers particularly, but that ends up not really giving her what she wants in the end. And she gets in a
Yes.
very no-win situation where she's got more than she bargained for. And then she's
Yeah.
kind of stuck. And I think that that might be the case for a lot of those things. But it's interesting how people who are applying for patents for this technology, like Microsoft, are doing the patents, but saying, "Oh, but we're not going to use it. We're not going to use it. We're
Right.
going to roll that out." I'm like,
We
okay,
just want to
well,
make sure we can license it to somebody who decides to use it later
yeah, exactly,
and
yeah.
still profit from it.
So I just want to urge perspective, and I want to urge curiosity and asking
Yeah.
what for.
Yeah. And so you have the book, you have another book on the way, and you also have a
Yes.
podcast called Still Spoken that
Yeah.
examines death and technology. Can, for anybody who wants to keep, listen to more of what you have to say, can you tell us a little bit more about the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sort of just getting rolling with that. Again, I started it last year and then I had this leg injury and like all sorts of stuff going on. And 2021 is a nothing year for so many people, just like weirdness with pandemic stuff. So I've just gotten rolling on
Yeah.
it again. And so I talked to lots of different sorts of people who've got some kind of perspective on how we keep the sort of dead alive through us or through technology or through our storytelling or whatever. My most recent episode is awesome because it's with this guy called Jeffrey Sconce, who wrote a book in 2000 called Haunted Media, which is about, communication with the dead and the occult from the telegraph through to television. And I was kind of doing a 2 decades later revisiting with him, and we had the most fun conversation, and we just sort of just talk about all the different ways we've tried to connect with the dead through various technologies since forever. But I had a great conversation with Carl Oman, who was one of the guys who predicted when there's going to be more dead people on Facebook than live people on Facebook. So I had a fab conversation with him for, I think, the third episode about the Dead Professor Society, which is the story that I told you about the student at Concordia University who was being taught by a dead guy. So I get into a lot more depth with a lot of really cool people on the podcast, and there's lots more exciting stuff ahead because this area is so fascinating. It goes in so many different directions, and there will be a lot in there about privacy and about relationships and about all sorts of things like we've talked about today. So that's Still Spoken, and like the kids say, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
Terrific. Elaine, thanks so much for taking this time to spend with us here on the Orchid Private Podcast, and for going a little bit over time because we started a little bit late as well. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. No worries. I appreciate your having me on. I've had a really good time.
Good. And to everybody listening, until next time, stay free.